Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Benedict Cumberbatch, Shannon, Nicholas Hoult and Tom Holland fight for power in the long-delayed historical drama, The Current War. In the late 19th century, America is on the path to electrification and two men are competing for the future. The famous but cash-strapped Thomas Edison, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, has created a low-voltage direct current system, while wealthy businessman George Westinghouse, played by Shannon, controls the higher voltage alternating current system that can travel over greater distances than Edison's DC. The rivalry between the two men and their companies escalates when Edison publicly accuses AC of being unsafe, as the two race to sell their systems across the country, and who will get the contract to power the Chicago World's Fair. The Current War is the third film directed by Alfonso Gomez-Rejon, who previously directed Me and Earn the Dying Girl, which I absolutely adored. You'll probably be aware that this film has a very troubled production history. You might remember the first time it was supposed to be released back in 2017. It was meant to be the Weinstein Company's big prestige picture that year, and to that end, it premiered at that year's Toronto International Film Festival. But the version that played there was very much a rushed, compromised edit, and Gomez-Rejon was actually watching in attendance, noticing that this film wasn't working in the way that he intended it to, alongside critics that gave it middling to negative reviews, which would have scuttled an awards run. And then, when he got back to working on it even further, he discovered that Harvey Weinstein had taken the film away from him and was planning to do his own re-edit. In fact, that's exactly what he was working on when the scandal broke out that caused the Weinstein Company to completely collapse. So for a long time, the movie was left in limbo, like a number of other Weinstein titles like The Upside or Mary Magdalene. And then a new company bought all the Weinstein Company assets called Lantern Entertainment. They're effectively the successor to the Weinstein Company, and they planned to release The Current War internationally. But the problem was that the version they were releasing was obviously going to be the Weinstein re-edit, which is not the version that Gomez-Rejon wanted in theatres. Luckily, though, there was a handy bit of intervention. You see, Martin Scorsese is an executive producer on this film because Gomez-Rejon had worked as his personal assistant previously, and Scorsese served as something of a mentor figure for him on the production. But due to a contractual happenstance, it turns out that Scorsese had to approve whatever edit was released into cinemas, but Scorsese refused to allow that because he knew that Gomez-Rejon was unhappy with that edit. That meant that Gomez-Rejon was actually allowed to go back and fix the film in the way that he intended. So this is an all-new edit of the film that is totally different to the one that premiered back in 2017. Scenes have been taken out, and there have been new scenes shot in their place. They actually went back for a day with the cast in a farmhouse that was decorated with a whole bunch of different scene setups. And so this has totally new material, and what we've ended up getting released is the version that Gomez-Rejon is finally happy with. It's also a version that has been completely scrubbed of Weinstein's name from the credits. So The Current War, in its final released form, tells two stories. The one that it's supposed to be telling, and the one of how it got made. It helps the period in time that the film is telling is fascinating. America may be young as a country, but it's moving and evolving very, very fast. This is a time of great discovery, creativity, and innovation. What scientists and inventors were finding were things that were previously deemed to be impossible, to be the stuff of dreams, and turning them into reality. And I'm not just talking about electrification and lighting, I'm also talking about the things that Edison is working on, like the fact that he's got audio recordings, or that he's working on moving pictures, the very medium that we are watching this story on. That's reiterated several times over the course of the film. And what you're eventually seeing through the runtime is the modern world very much being forged right in front of us. We're on the cusp of the 20th century, and you get to see all these things that now we take for granted. Electrification and lighting is for many a commonplace miracle, and yet you see the struggle and how that came to be. And what these discoveries open up is whole new frontiers. They very quickly realise that whoever can claim that for themselves, that's the one that has the literal power over power. It's not just simply about winning, it's about carving out a legacy, not just as being the person in the history books that electrified America, but being able to shape the future in your own image. So fittingly, this is a battle that plays out over the length and breadth of the United States, which is visually represented by the fact that Edison keeps a map of the entire country with individual states having different coloured bulbs determining what system was sold to who. And similarly, the conflict between Westinghouse and Edison is also long distance. They only meet face to face at the very, very end of the film. Everything else is either through the press or in letters or via telephone calls. The scene that sets up the dynamic is very, very early on, where Westinghouse gets an invitation to meet Edison on his train, but Edison has been meeting with an investor and decides he's too tired and just decides to speed through the station. And as he does so, the two men catch glimpses of each other, and you can see the almost like power line surges by, but also the windows of the train also look a little bit like a film reel going by at the same time, to reiterate the idea of Edison working on that very medium. And as the two men look at each other, you realise that suddenly this has become more than simply professional, it's become personal, particularly in the eyes of Westinghouse, who takes this rudeness as an affront. That's the moment where the battle truly does begin. To give an electrical metaphor, these are two men whose lives are running in parallel. They both mirror and echo each other. Death touches both their lives, and yet they're running on the same circuit. Of the pair, I think that Thomas Edison is the most compelling, but that's because he has the most screen time, but also the most dramatic conflict. Edison is already well known for being an inventor in the eyes of the public at the beginning of the film, but he's struggling financially, and he sees electrification as a way of cementing his reputation. He's a family man, he's got a wife and kids, but he's more devoted to his inventions and his ideas than he is to them. He's very much a workaholic in that regard, and he only ends up confronting that when his wife Mary, played by Tuppence Middleton, falls ill with a degenerative disease, that his powers do actually have a limit. He cannot stop her from passing away. In that light, Edison seems almost futile, especially as he realises just how much time he has wasted with her. There's a moving, running motif through the film where he's listening to an audio recording of Mary through the course of the running time, desperately trying to turn back time, desperately trying to recapture the moments they missed the first time around. It's a little bit on the nose, but it's a good way of how this film tries to humanise these historical figures, which often are portrayed as being larger than life. And Edison is initially portrayed as a man of principles. He has some kind of moral conscience. He vouches for the safety of his inventions, that direct current is safer because of the lower voltage. And yet, in his grief and his desire to compete with Westinghouse, that starts to curdle and erode away. His big problem with alternating current is the voltage is so high that he considers it to be dangerous, that it will kill someone, and he tells the press about it and turns it into this very public spectacle, even arranging events where he hooks up animals to AC to demonstrate how dangerous the effects are. Yes, that's right, this film does portray Edison's notorious animal killings. Apparently, his conscience doesn't extend that far. That leads to him going even to murkier territory, because running alongside this story is also the invention of the electric chair, and Edison initially does not agree to be a part of that, but then when he sees the opportunity to slander AC even further, he starts to secretly aid in that project. He totally sells out his entire belief system because he wants to be the one that defeats Westinghouse. And so that kind of moral corruption makes the character extremely complicated, especially because you've also got Tom Holland as Samuel Insull, who would grow up to be one of the major inspirations for Citizen Kane, but you definitely won't see that in this movie. Insul here essentially serves as conscience to Edison. He serves as his secretary, and in the time that it took for this to be released, Holland has actually got top billing now, but it's the kind of underwritten role that reminds you that yes, this was exactly the kind of part he was getting right around the time he first got Spider-Man. If anything's a problem with Edison, it's Benedict Cumberbatch's performance. He hews very close to type here. This feels very much cut from the same cloth as things like The Imitation Game, because Cumberbatch has made an entire career out of playing geniuses. You know, he's work-obsessed, obstinate, to the point of being off-putting at times, and that certainly doesn't help Edison, because as written, in spite of the monstrous things that he does at points, we're also meant to feel somewhat sympathetic towards him, and Cumberbatch's icy cold approach really does not endear you towards him. And so I think that Cumberbatch doesn't shade Edison in a way that makes him feel distinctive. It feels like the same performance that he's given multiple times before. On the other hand, you have Michael Shannon as George Westinghouse, who is a businessman through and through, right down to the fact that he exploits the inherent weakness in Edison's DC system, which is just simply not practical outside of a developed city. So his gas-based system is the one that starts erecting lines across the country. And he doesn't really get involved in Edison's games very often because he doesn't need to. He knows that his system speaks for itself. It's cheap, it's reliable, and it works. But as a character, that means that the central conflict of the movie is largely one-sided, and also it doesn't really give us very much insight into him aside from his professionalism and practicality. He's very much looking out first and foremost for his workers. He has a large industry that he has to take care of, and so you get the sense that he is a fairly decent man, but also because he's not really engaging properly, there's a bit of a blank space there. And Shannon is a great actor, and this is an unusually reserved turn for him, but you do wish that there was a bit more material. And the film keeps using this flashback of a Civil War moment that he had, and how he was staring down the barrel of death. And it takes a very long time before you realise what that metaphor is meant to represent, but even so, it's not really illuminating about his psyche. In fact, if anyone is more involved with the war of words, it's actually his wife, played by Catherine Waterston. She's the one who's trying to encourage him to be more directly involved in the battle against Edison, and he's the one that's always trying to go for a more moderate position, and it's only fairly late into the film does Westinghouse start using some dirty tactics in the same way that Edison has to try and fight fire with fire, essentially. And so you've got that same kind of moral sort of erosion happening with that character, and that happens a lot later in the narrative. But even so, the central conflict of the movie never quite sparks to life, and that's not just because the fact that they don't share a lot of screen time, it's honestly because they are in two separate movies to one another. And between these two men lies a third figure, Nicholas Hoult's Nikola Tesla, and he, out of all of them, is perhaps the one that has the clearest view of the future. He can see things far beyond what Edison and Westinghouse are fighting over at this present moment, but the brilliance of his mind is totally underutilized. He starts out working for Edison, but Edison clearly feels threatened by him, especially when Tesla starts pointing out the inherent weaknesses in his system, so Tesla strikes out on his own. He sets up his own electrical company as a way of competing with the both of them, because he believes that he has something in his mind that is even greater than what the pair of them have come up with. And you think that he's going to be this kind of disruptive element, that he's the wild card figure, And that turns out to not actually be the case. And that's partly by design, because while we know him now, at this time, most people just ignored him, partly because of prejudice, because he was an immigrant, they felt that he was easy to take advantage of and exploit, and also the fact that he does have fairly expensive tastes. His personality doesn't exactly endear himself to people, and yet you wish that if that character was to be included, that they give him a more substantial role in this. Instead of actively engaging with the story, it feels like Tesla pops in every so often. He flirts around on the sidelines, and I get the impression that Tesla is meant to be the key to the future in some way, that whoever recognises him properly is the one that will truly be able to win the war. But I don't really get that from the way the film is structured. He often feels like he could have been cut out of this movie entirely and it wouldn't have made much difference. And that is a bit of a shame, because I do think that Nicholas Hoult is actually fairly good here. I think that his accent is fairly decent, and he gives more life to Tesla in his limited screen time than he did to Tolkien in the lead role of that biopic. But by far and away the biggest problem with the current war is that it's a constant clash between style and content. I can't remember the last time I saw a movie so wildly at war with itself. If you saw Gomez Rejon's previous film, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, you'll know that it was very heavily stylized, which made sense because it was about a bunch of aspiring filmmakers who watched a lot of art cinema, and as such the pacing and structure was often dictated by that, and so it felt very modern in that regard. The current war, on the other hand, does not work with this approach. If anything, it may signify that the movie was simply given to the wrong director. I can understand the choices here, in that obviously Gomez Rejon was trying to avoid the trap of a costume drama by being dull and musty, but this has the whole opposite problem. It's way too fast paced. It often plays like it's running in fast forward. It's a mess on screen, right from its very opening moments, which throws a lot of exposition at you in terms of text and cross-cutting various events, and Gomez Rejon seems to have taken the first really large opportunity he has to just do every single trick in the book, and it's often very, very distracting filmmaking. It feels really fidgety a lot of the time. Try to imagine someone filming a scene from one set of setups and then deciding about halfway through, how about we just do a whole bunch of different positions and film it a completely different way, and then editing, we'll just cut them both together. And that's exactly what certain scenes in the current war feel like. You've got loads upon loads of Dutch angles, you've got fisheye POV shots in the middle of conversations, or characters pushed into the corners of shots against backgrounds, and these are all elaborate, expressive camera tricks, but they don't seem to be serving the scenes that they're in. They're not communicating things to the audience. They often feel like they're there because they're showing off. It feels like Gomez Rejon is being flashy for the sake of flashy. It doesn't feel like an aesthetic this movie should be chasing, and that's not even mentioning the number of elaborate CGI establishing shots that swoop through the city like an over-caffeinated History Channel documentary, or even the editing is full of unnecessary flourishes, because often scenes are not only internally cut very quickly and never holding on a shot very long, but also you have scenes that are cross-cut with each other or split-screened, and you often wonder how things are playing out in relation to something else. It becomes very, very confusing to the point where it turns this story into something of a blur. And as an audience member, I found myself asking, what exactly am I supposed to feel here? The movie often plays like, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened. but what are you trying to say about them? If anything, this movie needs to be much longer. I would have gladly sat through a 20-minute longer version of the film, because at least then it would have been 2 hours long and would have just given things more room to breathe. That's the main problem here. It's so tightly edited to the point where you can barely comprehend what you're seeing. And what I think has ended up happening is that this tells a story of a production where clearly everything was second guessed. Coming out 2 years after its intended release, The Current War isn't a total disaster. There's definitely virtues that you can point to, like the fact that it's very handsomely mounted on the production side and it's well acted, even if I don't think all those performers get the very best of material, but it often feels like it's working in spite of itself, in spite of the editing and cinematography that are way overcooked and threaten to smother it. And what that betrays is that Gomez-Rejon clearly was lacking confidence in his own project, and he needn't have worried, because the history here, I feel, is inherently compelling. I'd almost recommend it on that alone, in spite of all its faults. And so, in that regard, I think it's just a blip for Gomez-Rejon. I just think he was the wrong man for the job here, and clearly he's a very talented person. He just needs the right project. But in terms of this being an awards contender, like this is potentially being billed to be, that's not going to be the case. I think fittingly, for a Weinstein Company film that was clearly intended for that purpose, it's going to be going away with very little. The Current War tells a fascinating story on the road to our modern world, but almost blows a fuse trying to do it in the process. The movie's troll production is all over the screen, not least of which because Alfonso Gomez-Rejon wildly over-directs the film as it flies through history at rocket speed, filling his scenes with odd camera angles and needless clutter that is more disorientating than it is engaging. While it doesn't give one space to be bored, it doesn't give us room to breathe, and often comes with a disservice of the characters. Cumberbatch's Edison is the most developed and complex of the ensemble, but his performance feels like just another one of his moody geniuses, and the conflict with Shannon's Westinghouse doesn't quite spark because the two men are kept apart. Elsewhere, the likes of Tom Holland and Catherine Waterston try to make the most of thin supporting roles, while Nikola Holt's Tesla floats on the sidelines rather than being actively involved. The Current War isn't a total dud, but it feels like a great film is lost somewhere in prestige bait. If you like this review, then you can keep my lights on over at Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.